A Sunday school teacher asked the children just before she dismissed them to go to church, "And why is it necessary to be quiet in church?" Annie replied, "Because people are sleeping." Two boys were walking home from Sunday school after hearing a strong preaching on the devil. One said to the other, "What do you think about all that Satan stuff?" The other boy replied, "Well, you know how Santa Claus turned out. It's probably just your dad." And reflecting on today's meditation and today's topic, a Sunday school teacher challenged her children to take some time on Sunday afternoon to write a letter to God. And they were to bring their letters back the following Sunday. One little boy wrote, "Dear God, we had a good time in church today. Wish you could have been there." Out of the mouth of babes. Well, like I said earlier, today I'd like to take a little closer look at the principle that we have adopted here at Capital City Unity. Where two or more are gathered in my name, I am there. So to set the context, remember last week we took a look at the question of what we can do when faced with emotionally challenging life conditions. Suzanne brought that up in her meditation. And specifically, last week, we were exploring what others in our unity movement, we could respond together with others in our unity movement to the mass murders that occurred recently down in Gilroy and in El Paso and in Dayton, where a total of 36 people were killed. And so for some insight, we turned to the book of Job in the Old Testament. And we saw in the book of Job how Job was a victim of God's capriciousness because God had allowed Satan to challenge him into trying to prove the faithfulness of Job. So Satan was given permission to torment Job by taking away all of his wealth, killing off his family, and finally even taking away his physical health. Because God was wanting to make the point to Satan that Job's faith in God was more powerful than his reliance on external circumstances. Well, we saw that the torment that Job suffered was of such intensity that he almost did lose his faith, and he certainly was reduced to cursing the day that he was born and believing that for some reason God had abandoned him, and there was nothing Job, could do to restore that relationship. But in the most powerful section of the story, remember, God appears to Job in a whirlwind and reminds him of what's what. God tells Job exactly what we say we believe, which is there is only one presence, one power, one intelligence in the universe, and that Job lived, moved, and had his being in that one. Nothing else prevails, all else is illusion. And as Job is listening to God set the record straight, as it were, he gets it. In the face of the overwhelming fact that he, Job, is indeed 100% God's child, and that he will never be, can never be, abandoned by his Creator, regardless of the appearances, what does Job do? He retreats into silence to abide in peace with the Lord. Remember what Job said. He said, "I know you can do all things. Nothing you wish is impossible. I, Job, have spoken of the unspeakable and tried to grasp the infinite. I have heard you with my ears, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I will be quiet, comforted that I am dust." My eyes have seen you. Job is acknowledging here that he is in relationship with God, and that relationship, God and Job, is the primary truth of his existence. His determination to be quiet in the face of this truth is simply the most powerful affirmation of this that he could offer. My friends, we are, like Job, engaged in a permanent, unalterable, unbreakable relationship with God. So I'd like to explore that a little more deeply through this theme that Jesus shares in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, in the American Standard Version of the Bible, Matthew 18:20 reads, "For where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." Now, most Bible translations, as Suzanne so accurately noted in her meditation, say two or three, and some say, as we do, two or more. Now, I prefer that version, the two or more version, because it is more metaphysically accurate. Jesus is not saying only two or three, and four or more don't count. As we will see when we look at the greater context of this assertion in Matthew, he is saying two and any number beyond two. Before I get into this, by the way, I want to share something that I find very powerful and useful for us as truth students. For those of us who are interested in metaphysical Bible interpretation, I highly recommend a fairly recent development called the Fillmore Study Bible Project. It's headed by Mark Hicks, who's a licensed Unity teacher out of Baltimore. It's an ongoing research project that interweaves the entire body of work on the Bible by Charles Fillmore into the ASV, the American Standard Version Bible. The goal is to produce a study Bible with all of Fillmore's metaphysical interpretations annotated in the text, so that when we pick up the Bible, we'll have Charles Fillmore's notes as part of the text. The Fillmore Study Bible is part of the magnificent Fillmore Fellowship website, which archives an enormous number of Unity texts and resources. You can find online editions of all the works of Charles Fillmore, Myrtle Fillmore, Emily Cady, Eric Butterworth, Ernest Wilson, Ed Rabel, and many, many others. It's an amazing treasure trove for the student of our founder's approach to dwelling in Christ consciousness, Fillmore Fellowship. And I note that because last weekend was the Fillmore Festival, the annual celebration of the work of Charles Fillmore at the Village. So this resource is something I highly recommend to all of us who want to know more about the foundational texts and insights of the Unity movement. So with that background, to appreciate the metaphysical information about the two or more proclamation, let's look at the context of the entire statement. So this is actually 5 verses, Matthew 18:15 to 20. Jesus says, "And if thy brother sin against thee, go, show him his fault between thee and him alone. If he hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he hear thee not, take with thee 1 or 2 more, that at the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 every word may be established. And if he refuses to hear them, tell it unto the congregation. And if he refuse to hear the congregation, also let him be unto thee as the Gentile and the publican. Verily I say unto you, what things soever ye shall bound on earth shall be bound in heaven, and what things soever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say unto you, that if 2 of you shall agree on earth as touching anything that they shall ask, it will be done of them by my Father who is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." So that's the context of the 2 or more principle. The context is the resolution of a disagreement between 2 people who are in close relationship, in this case, 2 brothers. When we've experienced a grievance or an injury, Jesus instructs us here to simply state the case to the perpetrator, involving no one else. This was my experience when you did such and such to me. And if the wrongdoer accepts the blame, I hear you, I apologize. The harm will be absolved and peace restored. But if the perpetrator resists listening to the statement of harm, Jesus says now it's okay to involve others. Not to try the case, not to litigate it, not to take one side against the other, but to create a more powerful space for the truth to be heard. Jesus says, so that at the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3, every word may be established. Then Jesus says, if resistance remains, involve an even greater number. Create a more powerful space. In this case, bring the entire congregation in. So 2 or 3 becomes 2 or 4 or 10 or 20 or more. Now, this point to me is very profound. When 2 or more are gathered to support resolving a problem, healing a rift, transcending a division, a space gets created for the truth and healing and power to appear. The 2 or more have the power to create a healing space. Although I can clean up a mess I've made with you, when you let me see the impact that my actions have had on you, sometimes I may be too ashamed, I may be too frightened, I may be in denial, and refuse to step up and take ownership of my mistake. I then need some help to set things right. So engaging more allies, family, friends, even church members, who encourage each of us in the dispute to communicate as open-heartedly as we are able to will, Jesus says, create an environment for what we might today call nonviolent communication. So that's the beginning of this context. Having established that a good-hearted group is a tool for healing, Jesus now builds on this. And he says next, verily or truthfully, truly I say unto you, what things soever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. And what things soever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So now we can say that first he is asserting that the resolution of the problem, the healing of the injury, the reconciliation of warring parties that occurred with the help of the group is a sacred event. The 2 parties can be confident that whatever agreement they have made to resolve their conflict will be effective because this agreement is sanctified. Whatever you shall bind, in this case means whatever you shall agree to, hold yourselves accountable for. And loose means whatever we agree to let go of, to end, to stop. But Jesus, at the same time, he says this, expands the promise from not just merely the peaceful resolution of conflict, but in fact to what things soever. Whatever the 2 or more who originally gathered to support reconciliation call for, whatever they agree to, whatever covenant they create, will manifest as they intend it to. Whatever it is, not merely reconciliation, but whatever. So now we see the 2 or more principle coming into its greater focus. And Jesus repeats this. Again I say unto you, if 2 of you shall agree on earth as touching anything that they shall ask, it will be done for them of my Father who is in heaven. Touching anything they shall ask, it shall be done. Now this is an enunciation by Jesus of the principle of collective manifestation. Whatever we agree to do, when we ask for divine support, it will be given. It will happen. And with divine support, it will be manifest as agreed. And then he brings in the final statement, for where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. So now notice what Jesus does. He's now kicking this up exponentially. Yes, 2 or more can create a healing space. That's the first part of the passage. And yes, 2 or more can command God's support for our decisions. And yes, when we agree on something and ask for its manifestation, it will happen. But the truth is, the final statement that Jesus makes in this section is that these things are possible because the very I am of Christ consciousness is physically, emotionally, and spiritually present when 2 or more of us invoke the truth of our spiritual substance. When we call upon this, the I am manifests itself consciously. For where 2 or more are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Now, according to the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, name means authority, or that which unites the right to control with the power to control. And the metaphysical meaning of Jesus, according to the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, is the I in man, in humanity, the self, the directive power, raised to divine understanding and power, the I am identity. So for us to gather in his name, then, means that we invoke the authority of the Christ, the I am of our being, to presence itself in and among us. And when we do so, the I am becomes what is happening consciously. Now, of course, since there is only God is always happening. God, the substance of the universe, pervades every element from the tiniest subatomic particles to the vast cosmos itself. Of course, even when I'm alone, the I am is also present. So why does Jesus make this distinction in Matthew? Where two or more are gathered, there I am. Well, this brings us back to what we saw in the story of Job. Because we find our spiritual well-being in conscious relationship with the divine mind within. We are called to create, develop, and enjoy our relationship with God by creating, developing, and enjoying our relationship with one another. We are created entirely social beings. There's no such thing as a solitary human being. You try to think about it, you cannot conjure up a thought of what it would mean to have only one human being on the planet. There wouldn't even be consciousness. Because the word conscious comes from the Latin words meaning know together. There would be no one to know anything together, so there would be no consciousness, not as we understand it. As I was musing this, I was like, we don't even come into being except as a social act. It takes two of us to make one of us. Even though sometimes we may feel isolated and alone and the only one who ever felt such pain, that's part of our human nature. But we wouldn't feel lonely if by nature we were solitary, would we? If we were solitary, loneliness would be what we would want to feel. No, everything about us develops in social relationships. We live, move, and have our being with each other from the very beginning of our lives. From the moment of conception till the moment of death, we are in social relationship with one another. And the two or more principle, then, is both the being and the commandment to find God in and among each other. Now, God is always in relationship with us, and we find that relationship manifesting in our relationship with one another. In other words, our relationship with God is both mystical, the internal sense, contact of the divine mind within, and practical, being with the God among ourselves, in our community, with one another. We find the divine identity within, as we know, by sitting and listening, by using our denials and affirmations. But we discover our divine identity within in order to discover it without. We first contact the divine within ourselves in order to contact the divine outside of ourselves. It turns out that Jesus is reminding us that when we love one another, we are the divine dancing with itself. The Christ in me greets the Christ in thee, as we sang earlier. Now this insight, I was thinking about this insight is only implicit in Lessons in Truth, and therefore can easily go missing in New Thought. We will look into this more carefully in September. I'm going to do a series of talks that I'm calling Lessons in Love. We're going to look at this love connection part of the truth that we are called to express and be. But I want to illuminate the challenge that we have of this by pointing out a couple weeks ago, after the latest round of debates among candidates for the Democratic nomination for president, the Washington Post published an article trying to understand the Marianne Williamson phenomenon, and this article attempted to take a look at and express what New Thought is all about. So let me read just a couple of paragraphs I think you'll find interesting. The Washington Post finally brings Charles Fillmore to the public's attention. But few iterations, writes, the woman's Tara Isabel Burton, few iterations of this American intuitional religion have had such a long-lasting effect on today's religious landscape as a little-remembered phenomenon called New Thought. A once ubiquitous craze that through its 20th century heirs came to deeply influence the thinking of President Trump, Marianne Williamson, and tens of millions of others. New thought, which flourished in the mid-1800s, was heavily shaped by the transcendentalist philosophers of the previous generation, writers like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who believed that the human self was the closest thing we have to a reflection of the divine. Well, that's accurate. For those thinkers, organized religion, indeed every mainstream institution, inhibited people from trusting their divinely sanctioned intuition, which they saw as a direct path to the truth. Quoting Emerson, "All that you call the world is the shadow of that substance which you are, the perpetual creation of the power of thought," Emerson wrote in 1842 in his essay, The Transcendentalist. Burton goes on to write, "New thought took this transcendentalist trust in the self and commercialized it." New thought commercialized trust in self. Its originator, a New Hampshire-born clockmaker, mesmerist, and faith healer named Phineas Quimby, preached a gospel of total psychic self-reliance, one largely shorn of Christian theology and trappings. There was nothing human beings couldn't do, he asserted, so long as they believed fully in themselves. Physical illness, personal misfortune, these were results of an improperly aligned mental system. Both the success of Quimby's traveling practice and later writings of his numerous followers and imitators, including Prentice Mulford, remember Prentice Mulford? He's the guy that wrote Thoughts Are Things, and Charles Fillmore, brought new thought, also popularly known as the mind cure and the Boston craze, I didn't know that one, to the masses. So what we see here is the mistake of the misunderstanding of New Thought when she says that Quimby preached a gospel of total psychic self-reliance shorn of Christian theology and trappings. That's simply not true. But one could see why one might make that as a summary. The essay asserts the mistaken notion that spiritual realization is basically a solitary venture. So it's easy, I think, for someone without the discipline that we've learned by following the Lessons in Truth, writings of Emily Cady, and all the writings of Charles Myrtle Fillmore to think that. And so this belief makes it easy to dismiss New Thought, as the writer says, as a get-rich prosperity gospel designed to make our self-indulgent culture worse. It's easy to believe that, as the Post writer says, New Thought is merely about trusting our divinely sanctioned intuition as the most direct path to the truth, as if each person's intuition is uniquely our own intuition, as opposed to the one Christ consciousness into which we all tap. The good news is, the truth is, our Unity founders did not tread the solitary path, nor did they recommend it. Remember, one of the first and most profound decisions Charles and Myrtle Fillmore made was to create a socially based prayer support program called Silent Unity. That's a concrete expression of the two or more principle. We pick up the phone and we speak to a prayer worker, and the two or more are there. And the healing energy is called forth into being through that relationship. The Fillmores founded a publishing house to print and distribute spiritual information, to socialize what they discovered in their work. They established centers where people gathered to learn and pray together. Charles Fillmore even created the affirmation, Jesus Christ is here now, lifting us to his consciousness. They trusted the truth that Jesus proclaimed in Matthew, where two or more are gathered, the I am is present. And we trust it here at Capital City as well, because Capital City Unity is yet another concrete expression of our faith in this principle, where two or more are gathered. We have each developed a spiritual discipline based on our individual commitment to denials and affirmations and meditation, and yet we also choose to share the results of that commitment, our spiritual work, with one another, with our families, and with our greater community. We could say that when two or more are gathered, we become aware that there is only one thing happening. And we trust that one to guide us, protect us, delight us, and love us. And we experience this in our commitment to and love for one another. Where two or more are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Look around at each other, my friends. Take a moment. The I am of us is present in what we see, in what we hear, what we feel. And together, when we ask for it, we manifest everything our hearts desire. So, Divine Presence, we are so grateful for this promise that you made, that when we gather together in your name, in your authority, that the truth of who we are manifests itself automatically, and that we can open our hearts, our minds, our feelings to this central truth, and we can relax any belief to the contrary. We can trust you in one another. This is the promise, the source, and the manifestation of peace, the peace that passes understanding. And we are so grateful that the promise you've made, we feel it kept in this moment together. Thank you, God. Amen.